Good day, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for attending. My name is Ryan Sharp, and I'm an assistant professor of English and affiliate faculty of ethnic studies here at Baylor. Today, we continue our series celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the publication of W.E.B. Du Bois's The Gift of Black Folk, The Negro in the Making of America. Recordings of the previous webinars can be found on the Baylor Library website. If you've not already done so, I would highly recommend you checking them out. They're all fantastic, and the planning committee and the panelists have all done a fantastic job throughout this series. Before I introduce the distinguished panel of scholars that we're blessed to learn from today, I want to take a moment to thank the team that organized this celebration of the publication of the Gift of Black Folk. These folks include Dr. Stephanie Body, Associate Professor of Church and Community Ministries, Sine Wood and Ezra Cho of the Baylor Libraries, Dr. Stephen Reed, Vice Provost for Faculty Diversity and Belonging, Dr. Jamal Dominique Hopkins, Associate Professor of Christian Scriptures and Director of the Black Church Studies Program, Dr. Ronald Johnson, Ralph and Bessie May Lynn, Chair of History and Associate Professor, and Dr. Jerry Park, Associate Professor of Sociology. Further, this series has been and continues to be guided and supported by other individuals, as well as programs and units spread throughout the university, and a huge shout out to them as well. Published in 1924, Du Bois writes The Gift of Black Folk during the formative years of the Harlem Renaissance and the broader New Negro movement. And as such, Du Bois is writing in response to the systemic racism of the Jim Crow era, as he names and claims the many Black contributions to US society, democracy, in the case of the chapter we're charged with today, art and literature, from the late 18th century through the early 20th century. In this way, The Gift of Black Folk is an important precursor to Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, which comes out about 10 years later, which itself challenges at the current time, academic views of Reconstruction. While no text is exhaustive, in and through The Gift of Black Folk, Du Bois does us a great service chronicling and cataloging the histories of Black excellence and perseverance. In this, the fifth installment of Baylor's webinar series, we focus on the Negro art and literature chapter of Du Bois's iconic text. Du Bois opens this chapter taking a broader diasporic focus, weaving from Egypt to how Black cultural producers helped shape Russian literature and Spanish painting, and ends the chapter with a brief look at Black scientists like Benjamin Banneker. Yet the chapter's primary aim is to survey Black influences and impacts on US literary, performative, and visual arts through the early 1920s. For more on Du Bois's work in the chapter and its significance, I'll get off the mic here in a second so we can do what we came here to do, which is to hear from these great scholars. I'm very grateful to be in their company and to be able to participate in what will no doubt be a deep and lively discussion of Du Bois, The Gift of Black Folks, and Black art and letters. The panelists will present in the order they are introduced. After their remarks, there will be a time for discussion and questions. So I'd encourage folks to make notes of anything that they'd like to discuss in response to the presentations. Also, we'll have a Q&A tab that you'll be able to use throughout the session that folks can engage with during the webinar. We hope folks will take advantage of that feature as well. So first up, we'll have Dr. Erica R. Edwards. Dr. Erica R. Edwards is Professor of African American Studies and English at Yale University. She's the author of The Other Side of Terror, Black Women and Culture of US Empire, which was awarded the John Hope Franklin Prize from the American Studies Association, and Charisma and the Fictions of Black Leadership, which was awarded the Modern Language Association's William Sanders Scarborough Prize. Edwards is a co-editor with Roderick Ferguson and Jeffrey Ogbar of Keywords for African American Studies. Her work on African American literature, politics, and gender critique has appeared in journals such as Differences, Callaloo, American Quarterly, and American Literary History, and her public-facing work has appeared in venues such as the Washington Post, Public Books, and A-Line, a journal of progressive thought. Next, we'll have Dr. Njiba Freyiwat, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. She's in the History and Politics section of the Institute. Dr. Freyiwat researches, debates and thinks deeply about Pan-African consciousness and how to decolonize and re-Africanize knowledge production in global Africa. Her primary research focuses on Pan-Africanism, African political thought, and social movements in global Africa with a focus on Ghana, Tanzania, and the US. Dr. Ferry-Watt is engaged with several funded projects that center questions of decolonization, African agency, and Pan-Africanism. She recently released her first film titled Umoji, Africa Must Reunite Now. She's the editor-in-chief of the African Evaluation Journal and is an associate editor with Feminist Africa. Dr. Ferry-Watt is the treasurer of the African Studies Association of Africa. Most recently, she co-edited with Dr. Chek Thiam an issue of Global Africa Journal titled Pan-Africanism, African Research, and Global Issues. She's published several journal articles, book chapters, and technical reports. Third up, we have Dr. Elise Edwards, who is a Black feminist scholar, writer who crosses the disciplinary boundaries between theology, ethics, and architecture. Her work develops theological and ethical perspectives on social justice, human flourishing, and architecture and the arts as cultural expressions. Dr. Edwards is an assistant professor at Baylor University in religion and is an affiliate faculty in the Women and Gender Studies, associate director of the Baylor Initiative in Christianity and the Arts, and has served in leadership in several academic guilds and scholarly initiatives. She is also a registered architect and author of Architecture, Theology, and Ethics, Making Architectural Design More Just, and co-editor of the Routledge Handbook on Religion in Cities. And finally, we'll also have Dr. Sharice Barron, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Music at Harvard University. She's an ethnomusicologist and historian of African American religious culture. Dr. Barron earned her PhD in African and African American Studies with a secondary field of study in ethnomusicology from Harvard University. She holds a Master of Divinity, summa cum laude, from Yale Divinity School, where she was also an active student in the Institute of Sacred Music. Dr. Barron is a Forum for Theological Exploration doctoral fellowship alumna and member of the Harvard University Society of Horizons Scholars. Her current book project, The Platinum Age of Gospel, explores contemporary gospel music and illuminates the marked shifts away from previous eras of gospel performance and culture, which has defined the last 30 years of the genre. So without further ado, we'll open with Dr. Erica R. Edwards.
Thank you so much, Professor Sharp, for that generous introduction and for hosting us today. I also wanted to thank Professor Jerry Park for the invitation to be here and to everyone who worked to organize this event. And thank you all for being here. I just want to give a heads up that I have a couple of notes that I will drop in the chat along the way. So just keep an eye there. This is a short presentation, but I gave it a title anyway. My comments are called The Negroes in the Making. So W.E.B. Du Bois wrote The Gift of Black Folk, The Negroes in the Making of America, between the major touchstones of his life's work, between the early works that established him as a multidisciplinary creative analyst of Black American life, that would be The Philadelphia Negro, 1899, and The Souls of Black Folk, 1903, and what Professor Sharp just mentioned, his 1935 magnum opus, Black Reconstruction, which pioneered the very critical approach to the study of American history that is under persistent attack as we speak. He wrote the book between two world wars in the interwar period, when he was trying to reckon with mass destruction and hopelessness, and in the midst of the new Negro Renaissance, when the Black arts were on the rise and a young generation of Black artists, Langston Hughes, Zora Hurston, were reinventing all that Black art could be. So the goal of my comments today is to think about the Du Bois of that moment. So I'm going to make 2 points. One, about what we could think of as Du Bois's sociology of art, and two, Du Bois and the interwar Black arts. Right. So I'll begin with my first point about Du Bois's sociology of art. The question at the heart of the gift of Black folk is akin to, but slightly different from the one Du Bois asked in Souls of Black Folk 21 years earlier. How does it feel to be a problem? Akin because the presumption was the same, that the American Negro is constituted by a troubling, disabling two-ness. Two-ness. He is American, he is Negro. But here the presumption leads elsewhere. That is not about how it feels or what it means to be a problem, but how it feels and what it means to be American, to have been American, to have become American by force, and to have gifted to the nation under the duress of that force something like beauty. At the heart of this book is Du Bois's theory of abolition democracy, a theory he works out more fully in Black Reconstruction, but whose beginnings we see here in Chapter 5, The Reconstruction of Freedom. The theory was simply this: the action of the American Negro himself forced the nation into the Civil War. It was then the Negro who was responsible for, quote, one of the greatest attempts to spread democracy which the modern world has seen. For Du Bois, abolition democracy, the democracy that is yet unrealized, the democracy that is possible only if we continue with the great abolition movements of American history, is the gift of the Negro. So the Negro is the subject, the agent, the maker of American democracy, not its passive object. The Negro is the subject, the maker of history, not its passive observer. And the Negro is the subject, the maker of American art, not its passive consumer. Chapter 8 of The Gift of the Negro is driven by Du Bois's impulse to catalog, to name and classify all the Black artists, writers, journalists, preachers, prophets that Du Bois could think of. The method is sociological. In the attempt to map social transformation, it surveys and gathers. And in some sense, it quantifies abstract values in the field of artistic production, values like influence or merit or beauty. One thing that strikes me is the claim that grounds this chapter on Negro art and literature, a claim about the exceptionality of the Negro's artistic sensibility. The Negro is primarily an artist, Du Bois says, and not because the Negro is capable of only emotion and not thought, but because the Negroes compose the only race which has held at bay the life-destroying forces of the tropics and has gained therefrom, in some slight compensation, a sense of beauty, particularly for sound and color, which characterizes the race. I think Du Bois is suggesting that perhaps it is constant exposure to trauma, or what the public health researcher Arlene T. Geronimus calls weathering, that lends to Black life its sensitivity, its drive for sensory input, its magnetism to color and sound, and to rhythm and texture. Which makes me think of Setha, the protagonist of Toni Morrison's Beloved, who thinks about all that her mother, Baby Suggs, had endured, and how her mother's recovery from the trauma of enslavement, was sensory work. She says, now I know why Baby Suggs pondered color her last years. She never had time to see, let alone enjoy it before. It took her a long time to finish with blue, then yellow, then green, and she was well into pink when she died. The Negro, having survived the Middle Passage, the battle, the lynching tree, both unimaginable overstimulation and enforced sensory deprivation, knows something about the recovery that aesthetic life affords: color, color and sound and texture. Du Bois's claim, then, isn't just about the Negro's gift or contribution to multiracial democracy. The claim is about the gift that is art itself, the power of making to express the essential subjectivity, the complex humanness of the one who makes and the race who makes. So Du Bois insists, let us count them, these Negroes in the making. The logic of the catalog form is accumulation. So you gather disparate objects into one place to tell a story of achievement. And Du Bois is aspiring to comprehensiveness. And given that presumption that what he's giving us is an exhaustive sociological field of a sociological survey of a field that is a list of every Black artist in history, it's really hard not to linger with Du Bois's pointed exclusions. His colleague Anna Julia Cooper goes unnamed here. And there are other giants that Du Bois, but not history, will erase. Ida Wells Barnett, Pauline Hopkins. But our role isn't to complete Du Bois's survey. It is rather to ask what motivated and organized it, and what theory of Black life and Black making undergirded its assumptions. And now I want to move to my second point about Du Bois and the interwar Black arts. And he doesn't mention himself, but Du Bois was also in the making. He was doing his scholarship, to be sure, but he was working in the creative genres too. He created a historical pageant that debuted in 1910 that was called the Star of Ethiopia. And I'm going to just link to the Wikipedia page about it. Um, an epic march through history centered around exceptional Black men, the pageant offered a mix of racial exceptionalism and divine inspiration. It dramatized the argument Du Bois made in 1926 in the criteria of Negro art, in which he argued that Negro art promised to, quote, let this world be beautiful in a dehumanizing industrial post-war context. Du Bois's famous assertion that all art is propaganda and ever must be echoed the implicit argument here in Negro art and literature and in his own artistic work, that the burden of socially conscious art falls upon the Negro because the Negro's experience and his very sensorium is exceptional. And in his 1928 novel, Dark Princess, a political romance, Du Bois dramatized the beginning of a worldwide workers' revolution. And he began with an American Negro who undergoes an education of the senses. His protagonist rejects Chicago electoral politics, for example, not because of his moral or political revolt, but rather because of his, quote, aesthetic disquiet. His revolt, Du Bois writes, was against bad taste, the illogical lack of fundamental harmony, the unnecessary dirt and waste, the ugliness of it all. Next, the protagonist sets about gathering color and texture to himself, filling an old apartment with a Turkish rug, what Du Bois calls a thing of dark, soft, warm coloring, and a Picasso painting and a Chinese carpet. So the protagonist cherishes the gift of the Negro in the making, that special second sight that Du Bois theorized so lyrically, not just the capacity to see oneself as a problem, as American and Negro, but also to see differently, to apprehend color differently, and to feel the world differently. There's a lot in this chapter, nestled in what looks like a sparsely annotated bibliography or exhibition list. There's an assessment of what Morrison will later call the Africanist presence in American literature. There's an early history of Negro literature at a moment when Black folks are turning to writing as a tool in the fight for racial equality, precisely because the field of politics is so violently shut down. And there's an identification of a key tension in the New Negro movement, whether Black art was to be appreciated on its own terms or evaluated on its capacity to move into the wider stream, as Du Bois puts it, of American literature. But what most moves me is not the sociological work that Du Bois is doing, the work of surveying and counting, but rather the psychological work, the work of cataloging what we could call sensory aesthetic responses, the sensory aesthetic responses of a neurodiverse people to an intensely hostile environment. When Black life was already bent past breaking as the Great War shook modernity to its core, the gift of the Negro was to have already considered bodily recovery and collective repair when both of these were and continue to be a constitutive impossibility of this American life. So let's return to Morrison and her Negro in the making, Baby Suggs. Even at the very end of her life, after Morrison's Baby Suggs watches her daughter do the unthinkable, bring death to her own child to protect the baby from re-enslavement, even then, when all seems lost, Baby Suggs makes an occasional request for color. And on first read, we might think that Baby Suggs gives in to despair when she finally announces that um, there was no bad luck in the world but white people, and they don't know when to stop. But before Baby Suggs leaves her daughter and granddaughter to hold that thought, she, quote, pulled up the quilt. This one small offering to herself of color and texture, this final moment of sensory soothing, this aestheticized rest, this slight compensation that DuBois suggests is inherent to the Negro who survived 400 years of forced sensory dysregulation at the hands of those with impeccable executive function. DuBois's catalog helps us learn how to approach such a gesture with our own second sight sharpened. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. I found that discussion of the sensory, and maybe because I'm going to be teaching Beloved soon, in a few weeks, the references to Morrison and Africanist presence and Baby Suggs were extremely resonant for me. Next up, we have Dr. Mjiba Breiwat.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And I want to echo my thanks to the organizers at Baylor for this really interesting and dynamic interaction with DuBois's work. When I've read this work as a Pan-Africanist, Pan-African activist who also happens to be an academic, three key things stood out to me. The first concept that stood out to me was resistance. And I'll take us through why I think that these are acts of resistance. The second concept that stood out to me is Black radical thought, like the tradition of Black radical thought. And the third concept that stood out to me was a historical cultural art as an African archive. So before I go through those three key points, I wanted to start off with a quote by DuBois, which I thought really struck me as very dynamic, right? DuBois says, one must note in this connection the rise and spread of a Negro press, magazines, and weeklies, which are voicing to the world with increasing power the thought of American Negroes. The influence of this new force in America is being recognized, and the circulation of these papers aggregate more than 1 million copies. And that stood out to me because as I'm thinking through this question of resistance, what does resistance look like in an era where the majority of people were either dealing with segregation or colonialism or even the aftermath, right, of the slave era, right? What does resistance look like in an era where there was push back against individuals who were fighting against systems of oppression? And for me, the very act of resistance of writing, for example, slave narratives, is a dynamic contribution to not just resisting against the imperial core and or resisting against slavery and or archiving and detailing the experiences of enslaved African people in the Americas, but it's also about an individual putting their individual safety and livelihood on the line for future generations of African people. And so as I was reading through the chapter, right, on art and literature, I began to say I began to think the very existence of artists like Harry T. Burleigh, right, is an act of resistance. The very fact that you have, for example, Paul Coffey writing an early account of Sierra Leone, ultimately countering, right, the American narrative that everything exists around America, this American existentialism, is an act of resistance. And even more significant than this act of resistance for me is the several slave narratives that began to emerge, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The narrative of a fugitive slave, right, by William Wells Brown, the Negro in the American Rebellion, the Black man, in a period in which Negro was the way in which Black and African people were described, right? In this very anti-human um, uh, uh, atmosphere, there was the courage to say, I'm writing a book about the Black man, right? And so for me, these are all acts of resistance. There was a quote which I couldn't find, I was just looking for in the text, in which Du Bois talked about this may appear passive. I don't think that anything about art and interactions from a literature perspective, or using art, whether it's poetry, whether it's literature, even whether it's music, during this period, the late 1800s and early 1900s, during that period, you just being able to do or to write literature was an act of resistance. And then writing literature ultimately condemning slavery and condemning slavery and exposing slavery to the entire world was a double act of resistance, if I may say, double act of resistance. And I have my timer here, so I want to make sure that I stay on my time. And so that's one thing that I think is particularly important. And then when I began to reflect and I began to do some additional research around this era and Du Bois and literature and its role and its linkages with liberation movements, right, and consciousness building, I began to see similar things, and I began to see articles that talked about resistance and then Black radical thought. And then it dawned on me that this is the early introductions to Black radical thought, right? So one may say, well, just doing a narrative about, the era of slavery or being a fugitive, how is that Black radical thought? Well, one, it's Black radical thought because it's challenging the institution of slavery, and it's challenging not only the institution of slavery but the political, economic, and social implications of the slave era, as well as the wealth that came from slavery, right? So to me, this is the early manifestations of Black radical thought. And so as we're kind of thinking about Black radical Pan-African thought, we can't begin to say that it starts or in the mid 1900s, versus we must link it back to these artists, literary artists, poets who were pushing back and resisting during this era. And so that's one sort of linkage, right? And I think I only have a few minutes, so I'm going to quickly shift. Another thing that I think is important about resistance as well as Black radical thought was the African Society of Boston writing essays on freedom. So it's one thing to write essays, to write about the slavery, right? It's another thing because you're ultimately saying that slavery is not correct. But the African Society of Boston was writing about freedom. So it's not just writing about being a victim, but it's about writing about what we want, where we want to go, what the next steps are. Again, a very radical approach during a period where African people were viewed as non-human globally, not just in the US, but globally. As Du Bois starts out with a very Pan-African and diasporic understanding of literature and art across the global Africa, as we call it, the continent and diaspora combined. Sorry, I'm throwing my hand so quickly. I hope it's not distracting anyone. And so that for me, I think are two particular points. One, this question that this literature, this archiving of literature, right, of Black people or Negro people, and Black is relative, right? Because who is a Negro? Everyone at that time was a Negro, which is why people from the Caribbean were included, like Paul, and people were included who were writing about Sierra Leone, like Paul Cuffey, right? With people who were born in the US at the time, but who were direct descendants of enslaved Africans were included because there's no definition of who or what a Negro is. And part of this interaction was even challenging this question of who exactly is a Negro. And then the last thing that I'll say, because my time is up, I have 1 minute, is that these works, what they do is they connect us to this historical, cultural art African archive, right? And so I am situated at the University of Ghana, and we have the J.H. Kwabena Nketiah Archives, which is a really significant archive on the continent. And one of the things that we see is that finding these works and taking them and making them part of our archives, of our collective African archives, are particularly important. Listening to the stories of persons who were engaged in, who were enslaved is really important for our archive. But what's more important is interpreting the experiences and the resistance that they had to engage with in order for us to be here today is a second thing that's really important for our archives. But as I know we have a lot of undergraduate students on this call, and so I'll just sort of make a plea to say that this work isn't just about the history of, artists, literature folks in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This is not what this is about. This is about the history of African people in the US being written through literature and art. And the last thing that I'll say, I'll close this with a quote, which I have. I thought I had identified, but apparently it has moved away. The quote is around oral history. And the quote basically says that we must also respect, oral history, right? And in the text, Du Bois talked about Booker T. Washington being an orator and the beauty in which he interacted, right, as an orator, right, and this art of oral history, and taking our history and transferring it from one generation to the other and resisting through oral history is also something that needs to be interrogated as we begin to build this living collective community African archive. Thank you. And sorry for going.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fariwala. I really appreciated the way you were positioning the works that Du Bois lists as active acts of resistance, but then also his listing as a sort of building an archive or a sort of counter archive that is resisting like dominant U.S. narratives or dominant anti-Black narratives on a global scale. And so, thank you very much for those remarks. And next, we'll have Dr. Elise Edwards giving her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. It is exciting to be here. I thank the organizers for putting this together, for inviting me. I also have to say I'm really excited to be on this panel, not just because of the topic, but I get to be on a panel with my sister, Erica Edwards, who I think is so brilliant and has already contributed a lot. There's overlap in some of our remarks, so I'll just dive into it. In this chapter on Negro art and literature, DuBois traces the gifts of African Americans as contributions to American life. And I'd like to explore some of the implications of that as it relates to the study of religion, specifically my area of specialty, Christian theology and ethics. So there are two parts to my remarks. First, focusing on the influence of Black art, culture, and literature in the development of American religion. And we see DuBois tracing some of these connections. And then secondly, I'll talk about the influence of Black art, culture, and literature in the development of Black liberation theology and womanist theology and ethics. So let's start with the influence of Black art, culture, and literature in the development of American religion. I find it intriguing that DuBois opens this chapter on art and literature with a reference to spirituality. This makes sense given where this chapter falls in the book. It's between chapters on American folk music, the music that includes what we would call spirituals, and the chapter on spirituality, the final chapter. On page 155, DuBois writes this quote that Erica Edwards has already shared with us, but I'll read it again. He says, "The Negro is primarily an artist. The usual way of putting this is to speak disdainfully of his sensuous nature. This means that the only race which has held at bay the life-destroying forces of the tropics has gained therefrom, in some slight compensation, a sense of beauty, particularly for sound and color, which characterizes the race." Now, I think it's clear that he's taking a dig at, that he's critical of the idea that African Americans are just sort of naturally more physically inclined, or that they are overly sexual, that they're more tapped into this kind of sensuous nature, and that in some ways this means that African Americans are better able to connect to a sense of beauty and appreciation for culture. So it's this idea that like rhythm is just kind of innate in the African American body, making Black people better dancers or singers or rappers. But he's saying in a positive way that the other side of this idea is that the connection to sound and color and beauty, or what sometimes gets described as aesthetics, is something that comes out of African Americans as a way of fighting against the death-dealing social and physical structures of slavery and Jim Crow and oppressive life in the Americas. And he sees this capacity and legacy of African American art and culture as something connected to a spirituality that benefits or could benefit other Americans too. So lower on that same page on 155, DuBois continues, "Beyond the specific ways in which the Negro has contributed to American art stands undoubtedly his spirit of gaiety and the exotic charm which his presence has loaned the parts of America which were spiritually free enough to enjoy it." In other words, there's a kind of American spirituality and religiosity that rejects the sensuality and joy and freedom that can be found in some forms of African American art and culture. So we often describe this as like a kind of Puritan way of religiosity, right? It doesn't like joy, right? But DuBois is talking about how this is a gift that those who are more spiritually free can accept. And in these statements, I find a connection to the kind of work that's been done over the past century in religious studies and in history to trace the development of Black religion. So there's been lots of scholarship on this, and Wilmore's Black Religion and Black Radicalism, an interpretation of the religious history of African Americans, written in 1963, is a classic, as is Slave Religion, the Invisible Institution in the Antebellum South from 1978. But there was also a documentary series about a decade ago on PBS called This Far by Faith. I loved that series, and you can still find it for free on Vimeo and probably on the PBS Passport app too. But it shows how African-American religious experience becomes an innovative form of religious practice, not only because it draws together multiple religious traditions from slavery through the present, and here we're talking about Christianity, Islam, African indigenous traditions, but because this form of American religiosity is incorporating music, spirituality, dance, performance, oration, and the kinds of artistic creations that are celebrated in this chapter of The Gift of Black Folk. So the series explores the connection between faith and the development of African-American cultural values, and it does so in a way that is artistically beautiful. This Far by Faith also had a companion book of the same title that was written by Juan Williams and a scholar named Quentin Dixie, which goes beyond the series to explore the full diversity of African-American religious expression. But what Du Bois says in this chapter about art and literature can also be said of Black religion, and he offers a kind of typology on page 157. He says the influence of Black art and literature on broader American culture is one way of understanding it. The second typology is the development of Black art and literature for and by Black people. So here I think of like the slogan FUBU, for us, by us. And then third, the typology is the number of Black Americans who have like secured their place in the recognized halls of public regard. So they've secured their place in the canon, so to speak. So for the first typology, you can see the way that a tradition like call and response as a Black cultural form becomes part of the broader or a broader musical pattern in American church life. It gets brought into American Pentecostalism and in charismatic movements. It's something that Black culture has contributed to broader American culture. And people don't even know that it's connected to a kind of Black origin. For the second typology, the development of Black art and literature for and by Black people, you can see the development of Negro spirituals and gospel music and blues and jazz. In 1972, the theologian James Cone wrote The Spirituals and the Blues, a major examination of the soul songs that emerged from slavery and Jim Crow oppression. This was after Cone published two other books on Black theology and Black power, in which he was criticized for relying on Eurocentric modes of theology. But in The Spirituals and the Blues, he amplifies Black voices and what Cheryl Townsend Gilkes calls the witness of enslaved Africans and their descendants. We also recognize, of course, that African-American artistry in music and rock and roll was brought into Black church life, but also back to the first typology, praise and worship music, broadly in the world. So representing the third typology, African Americans who have secured their reputation in American art and literature, Du Bois names Phillis Wheatley, a poet who expresses religious themes through art, contributing to the shaping of American religion in the First Great Awakening. In her work, we can see what George Whitfield's sermons had, not just historically, but theologically. And she's engaging in a kind of theological writing through poetry before you have women like Jarena Lee or Sojourner Truth or the Grimke sisters, or even someone like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And it's not just her poems, but her other writings too. And there's a letter in which Wheatley is writing to a Native American pastor. And she says, in every human breast, God has implanted a principle, which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. So that brings me to my second point, and this is brief, but this is the influence of Black art, culture, and literature in the development of Black liberation theology and womanist theology and ethics. So this idea of deliverance from oppression, as Wheatley describes it, or spiritual freedom that Du Bois is talking about, is really a key theme that comes out in the development of Black theology in the United States. Liberation theology is a collective term for a group of related theologies, which rose to prominence in the last decades of the 20th century, the last 3 decades of the 20th century. Liberation theology's impact on theological method and Christian thinking on social justice issues has been especially profound. Liberation theologians adopt a prophetic approach to doing theology, and the word liberation itself reflects a concern for how salvation and sin are experienced in this life, not just the afterlife. I mentioned James Cone, who has major development in in Black liberation theology, but we have to recognize that the movement wasn't just an American thing, which you know, the connections, as we were just talking about with Pan-Africanism, become really important here. It was a global phenomenon. Just last night, I was reading a book by Gustavo Gutierrez, a Latin American liberation theologian, writing in the 60s and 70s of the 20th century. And he's citing Cone's work on the spirituals and the blues and talking about the global collaborations between Black liberation scholars and third world theologians. And this is, you know, 30 to 40, 50 years ago that this kind of collaboration is happening, centering the voices of Black experience within the music and the writings of the Black people being discussed. So that's one of the key points here. And we see that in the development of womanist theology. It's a theological framework that centers the experiences and perspectives of Black women. And here it's focused on Black people as agents and producers of culture, not just passive recipients, a theme we see in this chapter. Womanist theology is inconceivable. It's really incomprehensible without the writings of women like Alice Walker and Zora Neale Hurston and Toni Morrison. Stacey Floyd Thomas's book on methods in womanist ethics, called Mining the Motherlode, begins with a chapter on Black women's literary analysis as a source for constructive womanist ethics. So art and literature, especially those produced by Black women, gives testimonies to Black women's lived experiences that are then brought into theological and ethical work by providing firsthand accounts, but also these artistic renditions of the challenges that Black women face and their response to those challenges. So I'll conclude there by saying that the incorporating of art and literature of Black women and recognizing the gift of Black folk through the various forms of art and literature and cultural production turns our attention to a more nuanced understanding of American faith and spirituality. In the same ways that you can't make a genuine argument about the gift of American music, art, and literature to the world and leave out the contributions of Black folk, you can't talk about any gifts as well as the harmful legacies of American Christianity, American spirituality, and American faith without Black folk and their cultural production. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Thank you. One of my favorite things about this panel is that we have this kind of folks from a diversity of disciplines that folks are coming from. So it's very interesting to hear you talk about how DuBois's collecting is making a particular sort of statement about the construction of the new Negro, but also the construction of new Negro spirituality and faith. And at the center of that is Black women and the ways that they're shaping those sorts of thoughts and ways of creating art and spirituality. So thank you. And finally, we have Dr. Charisse Barron, and she'll be our last presentation before the Q&A.
Hi, everybody. It is my delight to be here with you all and to be on a panel made up of women who are so brilliant. And I want to say thank you to Professor Ryan Sharp for being such a great host for us today. And thank you to the organizers of this panel for inviting me to be here. So I'm going to jump in and I'll try to not repeat what my colleagues have already said about this 8th chapter of DuBois's The Gift of Black Folk. But indeed, this is a rich chapter and so much can be mined from it. So let's jump in. In this chapter, we find that Du Bois is making the case that Black people have contributed significantly to the world of the arts and literature in the United States. And this book was published in 1924. And during this period, we see the emergence of the Harlem Renaissance. But also during this period, we still see an overwhelming negative portrayal of Black people in popular culture, in entertainment, in art, and in literature. And Du Bois is saying in this chapter that the work of Black folk in the world, the artistic and literary work of Black folk in the world is quite powerful, it's meaningful, and Black folk have been able to do this work of creative arts despite the obstacles. Now, even though Du Bois published The Gift of Black Folk about 100 years ago, well, actually 100 years ago, and although his work, Souls of Black Folk, is 21 years older than that, both of these texts are still incredibly relevant today, especially in this moment where we're seeing a bit of American history repeating itself. So I'm reminded of Du Bois's discussions of the problem of the color line and the conception of double consciousness that he lifts up in Souls of Black Folks. But there's a particular quote that I want to bring our attention to that Du Bois shares in the 8th chapter of The Gift of Black Folk. And he says this: he emerged slowly, and Du Bois is talking about the Black man. He emerged slowly, beginning about 1830, as a dull, stupid, but contented slave, capable of dog-like devotion, superstitious, and incapable of education. Then, in the abolition controversy, he became a victim, a man of sorrows, a fugitive chased by bloodhounds, a beautiful raped octoroon, a crucified Uncle Tom, but a lay figure, objectively pitiable, but seldom subjectively conceived. So Du Bois is saying it's a pretty sad story that's being told about Black folk in American popular culture. And we know that blackface minstrelsy had a lot to do with how Black people were imagined and even continue to be imagined today and perceived in the American imagination. But by the 1840s, minstrelsy in America was America's greatest form of entertainment. We can think of blackface minstrelsy as common as going to the movies. We can think of it as something that was extremely common, extremely ubiquitous, and it was helping to codify these negative portrayals of Black people. So here's what Du Bois had to say about minstrel companies as early as 1820. And I'm pulling this quote from the 8th chapter of The Gift of Black Folk. Du Bois says, minstrel companies imitating Negro songs and dances and blackening their faces gained a great vogue until long after the Civil War. And we know the Civil War ended in 1865. Negroes themselves began to appear as principals in minstrel companies after a time, and indeed as early as 1820, there was an African company playing in New York. No sooner had the Negro become the principal in the minstrel shows that he began to develop and uplift the art. So Du Bois is saying that minstrel shows were extremely common, but once Black people started to participate in them, they began to uplift the depictions. And as we talk about art and literature more broadly in this chapter, I want to bring us to the contemporary moment and to the art and literature of hip hop, which now dominates the music of popular American music, but also the music of communities around the world. DuBois talks about writers and orators in this chapter, and he gives us a list of folks who are making waves in art and literature. And I want to relate that to what we're seeing today and to the work of Pulitzer Prize winning hip hop artist Kendrick Lamar. So you may be saying, what does hip hop and Kendrick Lamar have to do with minstrelsy? Well, one could argue that they have a lot to do with minstrelsy. I am among the scholars today who consider commercial hip hop to be a form of minstrelsy. And I will quote famed hip hop scholar Trisha Rose as she gives us a charge in relation to hip hop. And as she talks about the minstrelsy that can be seen in the work, she says this: "We must fight for a progressive social justice, inspired, culturally nuanced take on hip hop, a vision that rejects the morally hyper-conservative agenda and the whatever sells works for me brand of hustlers, neo-minstrelsy, that have become so lucrative and accessible for the youth in poor Black communities today." Now, she wrote this in 2008. This was published in 2008 in her book called The Hip Hop Wars. And she's saying we need to push back against this kind of neo-minstrelsy that has become so lucrative. And so, as I mentioned, I'm one of the scholars who does see a strain of minstrelsy in commercial hip hop. Although the music started as a kind of protest music, today it has really morphed into a kind of modern day minstrelsy. But there are folks who are taking up the work to uplift hip hop and to point it back towards its legacy of activism. So that brings us to Super Bowl 59, which took place Sunday. And if we think of minstrelsy as a legacy of slavery, we can certainly problematize American football and think of it as another legacy of slavery. But we're not going to talk about that right now. What I want us to talk about instead is to think about what Kendrick Lamar is perhaps doing to uplift hip hop and to say something different on this grand scale as much as is possible within the confines and the context of commercialized hip hop. Remember that the Super Bowl is must watch television, and the halftime show is a center point of this. So I just want to play a tiny clip of Lamar's performance, and hopefully you can hear it. But this is a very short clip in which he's signifying on Gil Scott-Heron's poem, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." So here's Kendrick Lamar. Here we go.
The revolution about to be televised. You picked the right time, but the wrong guy.
That's it. That's all I'm giving you. But we can certainly play more in the Q&A. But he says the revolution is about to be televised. You picked the right time and the wrong guy. Again, Kendrick Lamar is a Pulitzer Prize winner, and he is a gifted lyricist, a gifted poet. I think that can be agreed regardless of where you stand on the issue of the good or bad of what commercial hip hop is doing. So the question is hip hop in all its commercialized and appropriated forms in the United States and across the globe, within the Black community and across race and ethnicity, is this music in its commercialized and appropriated forms, is this music helping or injuring the cause of liberating Black people? After celebrating 50 years of commercial hip hop, this question still remains. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Barron. That was very, very interesting remarks. And I'm also finding myself kind of reflecting on just the ways in which performance functions when it's consumed by different audiences. And so that's has my mind rolling on so many different directions. And we're going to open into the Q&A here. And so if all the panelists want to go ahead and turn their cameras on, I wanted to throw this out maybe in light of the connections, particularly between that last presentation and the first presentation. There's ideas about what Black art does or should do, and what is DuBois in his listing, like Dr. Erica Edwards said at the beginning, there's an intentionality of what is included and then what is excluded in his cataloging. And so I'm curious if we might, not so long after the publication of The Gift of Black Folks, we have Langston Hughes, who's only briefly mentioned in the listing because his Weary Blues doesn't come out until a couple years later. But he says in the Negro Artist and Racial Mountain presents a particular sort of argument about what the Black artists should do and what they should not be ashamed to do, and so on and so forth. But then there's also these other conversations about whether or not the Black artist needs to be conscious of the audience that is consuming their performance. And so I'm curious how you all are interpreting that, either in the chapter or just in your work in general. And I'd appreciate just to hearing your thoughts and learning from y'all.
I'll jump in. So what this reminds me of is Du Bois's quote from a speech he gave that's in The Crisis 1926, where he says, all art is propaganda. And so for me, even as I'm thinking about hip hop, thinking about Kendrick Lamar on that grand stage, thinking about how hip hop has been considered minstrelsy, I'm thinking about propaganda, right? The work to either push an issue in a good way or in a bad way. And so I think we are still at the point where we have to consider art by Black folks as propaganda, opposed to art for art's sake, right? Where you don't have to be race conscious as you're doing the work. So that's my take. That's where I think Du Bois would push us to continue to see art in that way.
If I can jump in there, I mean, I think in this chapter where he's naming orators, right, and Black preachers as part of this legacy of art and literature, I mean, I think you can draw a direct connection between that and hip hop, right? So, I mean, that's part of it. I think there are multiple traditions of Black oration, from preaching to activism to music. I just learned that there's a category at the Grammys called Best Melodic Rap Performance, and that this year it went to Erykah Badu and Rhapsody, right? So it's like melodic rap performance, okay, right? This is part of the oration tradition as well, right? And I think what you see in that is this connection between not just this message of that can be used for uplift or just for the perpetuation of capitalist propaganda and all this stuff, right? You have this message there, but also this interweaving of spirituality, and that he's naming it as part of this Black preaching tradition, but putting that alongside these other art forms separate from the chapter on the gift of the Spirit, which I think is his final chapter, which he's saying ultimately this is like the gift, right? But seeing this as part of that, I think is always asking us, like Dr. Barron's asking us to consider, like, what's all mixed in this together. It's not just good or bad. And I'm an ethicist. I love to talk about what's good or bad, but how we have this complex layered message that's giving us things that are helping, at the same time they're undermining the very things we're trying to achieve. Which again takes me back to the fact that you have this entire genre of writing in theology and ethics today that's based on Black women's literature, this womanist scholarship that is looking at cultural production and saying, how is this being used against us, but also how are we using it to name our own experiences and move forward.
Mhm. Part of what's really interesting here is that Du Bois is making kind of contradicting arguments about the nature of Black art, right? Like, on the one hand, he begins this essay saying that the Negro is primarily an artist, that there's something foundational about the experience of, racial violence and racial hatred that sort of gives the Negro to the gift of art. But on the other hand, he says something like, the time has not yet come for the great development of American Negro literature because the economic stress is too great and the racial persecution is too bitter to allow for the leisure to actually create art, right? So, like, on the one hand, there's a kind of giftedness that is the nature of the Negro because of that the Negro has endured. And on the other hand, there's this kind of deprivation of, like, artistic time. And I think that's something to really think about when we're thinking about this moment of the 1920s, a moment in which we have this tremendous flowering of Black arts in, like, what we have called the Harlem Renaissance or the New Negro Renaissance. But at the same time, this fierce debate about what Black art was and how it was to be evaluated, as you said, Professor Sharp, right? Like, this is when Langston Hughes is arguing against the older generation of folks like Elaine Locke and maybe against Du Bois about, like, who the art was actually for and who it was from, to return to Elise's, like, point about the for us by usness of it. Like, Hughes was saying, like, the work of the Black artist emerges from, like, the low down folks, right? Like, from working class and poor people, and it's for us too, right? um and so I think, like, when we think about the kind of tradition of Black arts, we have to think about both the history of commodification and extraction, as Professor Barron was talking about, and also think about the kind of internal class struggles that have cohered around the Black work of art.
Yeah, and I can hopefully maybe add something. I don't know. I think a lot of the things I was thinking have been said, so I'll just add sort of two things. One thing I think that's interesting is that when we think about art and literature, um, oftentimes we divorce it from our everyday life, right? And I would contend that art is part of culture, which means that Black art or African art is also part of culture. And so as we begin to read, interact, engage with, reflect, right, on these, late 19th century, early 20th century, Black artists, we have to also recognize that this art is part of their culture, right? And it's also, and I think that also is the same with hip hop. If you look, we bump all the way up to like the 1980s when hip hop was, and I'll say so-called, established in the Bronx, because hip hop rhythms go back to the African continent, right? And so you can find, rhythms that go back to the Congo and to West Africa. So this whole notion of what was founded when and where, I think, should be interrogated. But that's all. They were also talking about life, their culture, right? And I'm saying they because, I wasn't necessarily there at the moment, but we could say our culture. We know culture is ever evolving. It's dynamic. It's not static, right? And so for me, you can see that trend, that this notion of culture. I was at just a very quick story. One time we were doing a seminar and we have seminars every Thursday at the Institute, and someone came and was talking about our costumes at like a festival, right? And oh, the costumes were so nice and blah 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 blah. And one of our professors, Professor Essie Sutherland Oddly, she so eloquently said, what you're saying is costumes is our culture, our dress. It's not costumes. It's not caricature, right? It's not the minstrel show where you come and you do fishbowl and you look out. And so linking art, Black art during this era to the culture of Black and African people during this era, you begin to see linkages between one's life and one's art. And I also think that the class struggle is really important, right? Inside of this period, particularly between the W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, for example, or even Booker T. Washington. And I think that we have to also recognize that where someone was raised, where they were born, what experiences they have impact their understanding of art, right? Marcus Garvey is a Jamaican through and through, but was talking about back to Africa. 1914, the UNIA was founded. I mean, the UNIA had 1 million members. And the reason I started with that quote about magazines is because the UNIA had the largest circulations of magazines, the Negro World. And at a point, Du Bois was incorrectly in a fight with Marcus Garvey. Later on, you see that he recognized the error of his ways and he became a staunch Pan-Africanist. So that also shows that our ideology can shift, right? Our engagement with art, with literature, with hip hop can exist. And I'll end here. Hip hop today, there is a difference between hip hop and rap. What we are experiencing on the stage today is rap. It is not hip hop. Thank you.
These are all interesting. This could be a conversation I feel like we could have for another hour or so, but I want to make sure I get some things in from the Q&A. And I love this question by Faith Juma, and she says, or they say, I should say, I wonder if Black art, music, and literature allows space for sharing Black joy as a form of resistance, as an act of resistance. And we've been talking about resistance quite a bit. And I'm wondering about how we might think about that question either through this chapter or just this as we are engaging with how the chapter, we're in the wake of the chapter in our contemporary moment.
And that really is the question of this chapter, right? Like it's why Du Bois begins with that question of not just like how have Black people survived, but in what ways has art been enlisted into the project of survival? And it seems like the answer that's implicit there is that art does serve this kind of it produces this reservoir of joy. And that's why I was trying to think about like sensory recovery in a way, like what art does is provide this kind of external object for this internal sense of joyfulness, right? Which as my sister pointed out is really like often comes into conflict in a Puritan culture that hates joy, so that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, on that, I'm doing reading for another class about liberation theologies, right? So this is in my mind all the time, and it's about like spiritual freedom and the idea that you are not restrained or held back by the structures that come against you in all different kinds of ways, in forms of religion and against, in forms of racism and sexism and homophobia and class struggle and all of these. But it's about like, what are we actually called to be? And it's joyful creatures that in focusing on questions like racism and having to defend this and write about this all the time, you're missing the fact that there is this other part of life that is not concerned with that. So I think this actually connects in a way to the idea about how Du Bois is talking about Black art in these multiple senses. And in this sense of the art that is for us and by us, there's certainly this expression of joy that's there. And here I'm thinking of the film version of Beloved, right, where you see baby Suggs in the woods, and she's calling people out in this ring shout to like dance. Like that's joy just in the moment there, right? And it's not for anybody else or for consumption. But it's also in a space where people are free to be without defining themselves in relation to this white gaze or in relation to their labor or these other things that are extracted. So it's like, yeah, there's space for joy. But as DuBois is saying, like, you got to have the leisure for that, or at least the space to express that, where you're not being narrowed into a kind of box. And I think some of those themes are coming up in Black scholarship now and have been for decades. But, you know, what are we writing about? And are there things that we could be focused on if we weren't having to be so preoccupied with race? That we're much more than this as Black scholars and artists. It's important work, but of course it's not the only.
Yeah,
Can I
and
say-
I also want to, oh, go ahead. Oh, okay. I also just wanted to add something about joy. I was on my way into the office this morning. I was listening to Bob Marley. And Bob Marley's one of my favorite songs is, I woke up in a curfew, right? That's not necessarily the most initially it doesn't sound like the most joyful song, because it's like, wow, you're in a curfew. I don't know where, I don't know who to talk to because I have to go over many oceans. But when I listen, right, to Bob Marley, and I don't think I'm the only one, it transports me to another space and time. And I think that art is the same way, right? Art and literature, and even during this era, oftentimes we think, and sorry to say, and I know no one here is suggesting this, but oftentimes we think, oh, as African people, we were enslaved and all we were doing was, being enslaved, and we didn't have anything else happening in life. People were getting married. People were having children. People were celebrating cultural festivities, right? People were there was joy. So the thing is, when you are oppressed, you believe that, oh, as an oppressed person, I also can't live. Let's also be clear that even in areas where there is heavy bombing, like for example in Palestine, or the bombing has stopped, there's still joy there. People are still getting married, right? People are still having children. There's some joy. People are still celebrating, culture, right? And so I think it's important for us to also acknowledge that as we're talking about resistance, we have also resisted through joy. And I wanted to just say, I wrote down, joy is resistance. Being able to say, I will enjoy my life. The Sekou Touré, the first president, and I'll stop after this. Sekou Touré, the first president of Ghana, he writes a book called Revolution, Culture, and Pan-Africanism, of Guinea. He writes a book called Revolution, Culture, and Pan-Africanism. And he says, the most human thing to do is to find happiness. And for me, as African Black people, even in the most difficult moments, there was some sliver of happiness and joy, even if we're dreaming of freedom. And that's our joy. Thank you.
Do I have, well, I was just going to say what's interesting, and I'm really glad that Professor Elise Edwards keeps bringing up religion, because one of the things that we've seen is that historically African-American Christianity, which has dominated the religious landscape for Black people for quite a while in the US, it was very much so rooted in joy, in a way that the kind of Puritan ideology, mainstream, white folks just weren't, right? So joy was built in, this joy that I have, the world can't take it away. As Christianity has shifted in its place of primacy, we're also seeing in the commercial music scene a dip in joy in the music, especially as it relates to romantic love. I mean, there have been studies done which show, less songs across the board, cross race, right, are about popular music, less about just love, right? And even when I think of the R&B music now, the big R&B singers who are young, a lot of it is very angsty. And then we know the formula for commercial hip hop is, drugs, guns, murder, sex, right? So there may be some joy in there, but I think as we watch the religious landscape shift, we've seen how joy gets represented in commercial music shift as well.
Again, I feel like we could continue talking about these points for a long time. And selfishly, I wish I could keep y'all here for several hours to talk about, but I know that there's folks that need to go to class or folks need to go to teach class. And so we're going to probably have to end it there. But I wanted to thank all our great panelists and the folks that attended online and everyone who helped make this possible. I know Ezra is going to be putting up a slide now with the CAE credit. If you can scan that QR code here, that's coming up in a second. The next installment of this webinar series will be a screening and discussion of Juneteenth, Faith and Freedom. I'm zooming here from Fort Worth, which is home to Miss Opal Lee, who's one of the mothers of the movement to make Juneteenth holiday. And so that's going to be taking place on February 21st. The reception will be at 5:30 with the screening starting at 6. But again, I wanted to thank our panelists for their brilliant remarks and for the discussion we were able to have and for people that participated on the Q&A online. And thank you everybody involved for making this happen and for including me because I feel blessed to have been here.